Howdy of you delicious people, I'm here today to review the pilot episode of Superman and Lois. So, this episode and or this show so far, reasonably to me, when going into any number of CW shows, immediately people need to go and want to watch a review about it because they're not quite sure how to feel about certain shows. Like immediately I know Batwoman tends to uh intrigue people to see if they're going to watch the show, or recently just kind of hearing people in utter anguish about watching the show. And so ultimately that is what is intriguing with a lot of people. I guess I could ultimately comb through and review Batwoman season 2, but I've just been hearing that it isn't really all that good. So looking at it, I'm like, should I really go and watch season 2 of Batwoman just to say that ultimately I watched it at some point? I don't know. Like, ultimately, I'm just kind of waiting and wondering if there's a CW show that is going to be good enough out there. And I honestly and truly believe right now for this one episode that Superman and Lois is delivering that, surprisingly. I thought that this show was really good. I think recently we have Superman's backstory, like basically a lot of nods to certain things and a lot of interesting approaches that are going on with this story. Uh, we ultimately have it to where there seems to be some kind of slight tweaks or slight differences in story that I've kind of seen before within shows or stuff like that. It seems like ultimately we have it to where seemingly uh, it seems that the special thing that ends up being a part of this first episode, I'm like, okay, like something about this seems a little off. Like something seems like years of gap of time range a little bit off. But I just kind of have to just go, it's a story. It's interesting. It is what it is. Uh, when going into this show, immediately I thought it was just kind of like, you know what? I think that this show is just kind of refreshing. Like, yeah, there isn't a lot going on with uh, Superman and his like absolute powers. Let's just say in the show, but there are also kind of some interesting visuals that are going along with this show. Like Superman does end up fighting somebody in this episode. Superman does end up doing some, of course, Superman-esh like feats, which I thought were really interesting. I was like, wow, like I didn't think that ultimately like a Smallville would kind of do that something like this, but I guess this show can. You get to actually see Superman do a lot of like super strength like maneuvers, so I thought that was really interesting. Like to me, watching this show almost kind of like makes me think of like, man, it almost feels like this like it kind of feels like this show is like a movie. Like it's kind of like movie quality to me. Like it feels like it has a pretty decent script so far. It feels like there's some interesting visuals that maybe a little bit feel out of place when you have like kind of Clark and younger Clark. Uh, it kind of looks goofy. Where you have it to where it's like, I guess that has to be Clark because as a younger age, because I guess you just have to figure that out. But I think that there are some really good things here that this show does do. So ultimately, I would ultimately say like a thumbs up for this pilot episode. But again, with every single CW show, what might seem really good in the beginning, in the end, who knows where exactly it's going to go. So it might be a really good pilot episode, but then it might just be a lot of just like uh, it might just be a lot of just garbage after that until we get to, oh, okay, now it's going to pick up again. Oh, that's great. And because who knows? Because really, with the new normal and everything like that going on, like who knows who knows how much like action sequences are really going on. I think it would be interesting if ultimately they quite possibly maybe at some point, maybe later down the road, incorporate Supergirl into this story. Because when looking at it, knowing full well that Supergirl eventually her show had gotten canceled, and eventually I'd heard that the girl Supergirl had gotten pregnant and stuff like that. Uh, like I thought that was like, oh, good for her. But ultimately, I'm thinking like, well, maybe hey, maybe she'll come back for an episode as like a guest appearance or something like that to retie that. Otherwise, this Superman had kind of started from that show. Uh, but yeah, so recently when going into this, so far, thumbs up. Really enjoying this show. I would recommend people watch it. Uh, this might not hit the same for everybody. Some people might think it's boring, or they might think that it's not eventful enough. It's a pilot episode. Again, it's much better than any of the other garbage that I would sift through. Like it's way better than Batwoman, that's for sure. Like it doesn't have an agenda. It's not trying to it's not trying to tick anybody off. It's just like, hey, this is a show that anybody can enjoy. Uh, and it's slow enough and it's simple enough to otherwise just it's a feel good story that otherwise kind of combs through the life and or times of Superman, and it kind of gives people some nostalgic stuff of other Superman projects and stuff like that. So, really enjoyable, I think, so far. So, by and large, I think it is about that time to ultimately go. And plus, there is also some other characters that going into this first episode, I'm like, oh, okay, so this is their version of this person. Oh, okay, this is their version of that person. Oh, okay, cool. Because right away I was just like, okay, like, should I have to know every single person that lives in this life kind of thing? Like, should I know, like, their variation of Jonathan Kent and Martha Kent? Should I know their variation of, like, should I know, like, via verse engineering who every single one of these characters are, kind of thing? Should I have to know that? So let's go into spoiler time. Let's ultimately talk about going into this, because at the end of the day, like this story does take a different route. So without a doubt, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So we have it to where ultimately we have to showcase Clark Kent's origins of becoming Superman. So reasonably we have it to where we have a story where we kind of quickly gloss over some things and then ultimately we get into the real nitty gritty of the story. So we end up having it to where we have to showcase that of course Clark came here from Krypton and he crashed onto a planet, and we ultimately have to eventually we find out that Jonathan eventually did pass away, and ultimately Clark had gone to his funeral. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Clark is to eventually don the very first Action Comics #1 Superman costume, and ultimately uh, grab a vehicle and place it down, which ultimately is very reminiscent of the Action Comics #1 cover, the original Superman cover. And we ultimately have it to where Superman ends up walking up to some kid, and ultimately the kid's like, "Oh, hey man, nice suit," and he's like, "Oh, thanks. Like my mother made it," and I'm like, man, like this is like really like cool to have seen like a little Easter egg kind of thing of a approach within the early stages of this show. You ultimately have it to where eventually we have Clark who ends up meeting Lois, of course, doing the Daily Bugle or the Daily Planet. I always get those confused. So we end up having it to where it seems that everything is really going really quickly with the Lois and Clark relationship. They're already showcasing that Lois and Clark marry in the show. They showcase that Lois has, of course, a general father, where it seems that the general and Clark are going to be having conversations with one another. Lois's father will know Clark's secret, which I thought was really cool. So anytime that ultimately the general has some kind of um, like mission, we have it uh, to where Clark is getting mission statements from Lois's father, which I'm like, man, that is the most interesting way to approach this show. Like I was like, man, is that awesome? And plus two, like we have it to where Clark ultimately has two kids. He has two sons, and bizarrely they end up they are both like teenagers. They're like 14-ish years old. I'm like, wait a minute. Neither Lois nor Clark have really aged all that much during any of these portions of time, but they have like 14-year-old kids. I'm like, they don't look old enough to have 14-year-old kids, but I guess what am I to say? So we end up having it to where we have Lois and Clark with two kids, Jordan and Jonathan. And we have it to where Lois is trying to, or Clark is hiding the fact that quite possibly Jonathan or Jordan could have superpowers. I'm like, well, somebody's got to have some superpowers. Somebody's going to have some superpowers. So we end up having it to where Lois is just like, you know what? I think we should actually explain to them that you're Superman. Like, you should explain. And like, Clark is really just going like, no, like I think we should just not tell them, or like wait till they're much older and tell them. Like, because really we have it to where Clark is trying to protect his own secret, even from his kids. We ultimately have it to where seemingly the general is ultimately going and wanting to take out one of the kids out fishing. Told me just kind of give Clark some kind of out. We ultimately have it to where seemingly the general has probably been much more of a father to Jonathan and Jordan than probably Clark has, because Clark has always been gone. So we end up having it to where we have like a accident that at this radioactive plant. So we end up having it to where it seems that there's a crack, or there's a kind of a explosion of sorts at this radioactive plant. We end up having it to where Superman ends up coming up with this giant iceberg of sorts on top of his chest. He's just like holding it up, and like we have it to where like he's slowly coming down, and as it's coming down the ice is melting and is like providing basically like a source of rain and a source of being able to just melt the accident that had happened, and fixed this accident. So we seemingly have it to where in this show we end up finding out that it seems that there is some other supposedly Kryptonian that is to leaving a calling card for Clark in Kryptonian, ultimately telling him that that he's coming for him. He knows he's here and everything like that. So we end up having it. So we have that going on. But then we also have it to where seemingly we find out that Clark's mother, Martha, had died as well. So we end up having it to where they end up going to yet another funeral in this same episode. We end up having it to where ultimately Clark had also lost his job at the Daily Planet. Uh, so he's not a news reporter anymore. So he's like, well, like, what are we going to do? We ultimately have it to where Morgan Edge. Morgan Edge ultimately is working. It's not Perry that works uh, at the Daily Planet. We ultimately have a Morgan Edge character that seems to be really controlling the Daily Planet right now. So, and he, I guess, is a villainish character. I guess I would assume. So, but not quite as said exactly yet about Morgan Edge. I'm not very familiar with the Superman comic books because I don't tend to read those because I find them boring a lot of the times. Um, but anyways, we end up finding out that Clark is to go on and go back to Smallville, and we end up finding out that Lana Lang has ultimately married to a guy named Kyle. So, and I was thinking, I'm like, oh wait, what? It's not Whitney, like in Smallville. She didn't end up with Whitney after all. Uh, but anyways, so we go on here and we end up finding out when Lana and Kyle is catching up with Clark that it seems that we find out that it seems that Martha was going to sign over the deed to the or sign over her farm to eventually someone and ultimately have just enough money for the college funds for both Jonathan and Jordan. So we end up having it to where Clark is to find out that he is either to pay off the farm and keep the farm, or sell the farm and just have the money for his two kids college fund. Um, so we end up having it to where seemingly they're doing some investigation, thinking that there's some wonky things going on uh, with with the Kent farm. It seems like there's some inaccuracies or there's some stuff that doesn't quite make sense with all this. So, surefire enough, we end up having it to where we end up having the kids ultimately going and, of course, being young kids, and the otherwise are just like, well, hey, like, I want to check in the barn because ultimately there's a modem in the barn that can ultimately help increase the internet here. So we end up having to where Jordan ends up going into a ladder to try to get to this modem or whatever for the computer. He ends up falling and ends up crashing down some metal pieces upon both him and Jordan, and so or both Jordan and Jonathan. So we end up having it to where Clark ends up springing into action because ultimately someone had shouted that uh, it was Lana and Kyle's daughter ultimately had shouted that hey, these kids are hurt. So ultimately we have it to where Clark goes in there and grabs the metal pieces and just starts flinging them off to the side. So we eventually seemingly have it to where both Jonathan and Jordan had only gotten concussions. And so ultimately we have it to where immediately we find out that Jordan and Jonathan are questioning. It's like, how is it that we only got away with just having like small concussions? This makes no sense. And so ultimately it's like we have it to where it seems that Jordan and Jonathan are asking way too many questions. It seems that also that it seems that Jordan had been suffering from some mental issues or mental um, disorder or something of sorts. And so ultimately, it seems like they had to give him medication to be able to uh, like kind of cope with his issues. So we go in and eventually have it to where supposedly Jonathan and Jordan were told never to go into the barn, and of course that's one place they go into to check on the internet. And so they end up keep asking themselves, why is it that Clark never wanted them to go in the barn? What is such a secret thing that is to be in this barn? Because at first Clark said that there was a lot of things that ultimately could accidentally kill either one of the kids if they weren't smart about anything. So we end up having it to where Jordan and Jonathan end up going and Jordan and Jonathan end up going into I'm gonna have to pause here for a second. All right. So Jonathan and Jordan end up going back into the barn. So we end up having it to where we have eventually that Jonathan and Jordan end up going and stumbling upon a underneath portion of, or a kind of basement portion of this barn, and they end up finding an alien ship there that ultimately has a piece of alien tech on it. So we end up having it to where Jordan ends up going and finding this piece of tech to give it to their father, and ultimately say it's like, so this is the reason why, like, you wanted to have us not go to the bar because there's an alien ship that you found in there, and we ultimately have it to where Clark is like, well, I guess I have to tell them now, and Lois is like, told you, like, eventually, like, they were gonna figure it out, because we had it to where plenty enough times Clark had to give some reason that uh, he had to go and do news reports that were out of state or out of town or whatever. Hence why Clark was never really there for his sons. So we end up having it to where eventually Clark finally has to tell them the truth. He ultimately takes off his glasses and gives them to Lois, and he ultimately like explains to them it's like, well, yeah, I was from planet Krypton and I came here, and we ultimately have it to where their kids is like, well, that's Superman's story, and we ultimately have it to where Clark ends up taking this car and taking the bumper and like basically lifting the car up from over his head, and then eventually flies off with it. So we end up having it to where both Jonathan or Jordan end up thinking, they're like, oh my god, so eventually, like, we might be having powers? We might have powers? Like, we might be, like, superheroes and whatever? And so Clark is like, well, I'm not sure. Like, I don't know if both of you are going to have it or one of you are going to have it, and the other is going to get jealous because one has it, one doesn't. So we end up having it to where we're trying to figure out who has the superpowers and which one doesn't. So we eventually have it to where seemingly we end up finding out that uh, that seemingly the the Ken kids ends up going off into a party. While that is going on, we end up having it to where Clark ends up uh, going and trying to be told that there is quite possibly a mission that he needs to do from the general, and we ultimately have it to where Lois is saying, like, you know what, like, Clark still needs time. He's grieving. Like, give him some space. Um, like, and ultimately, like, the general basically says, like, well, the world will always need Superman, so it's basically like he needs to like keep doing this job. He needs to like every single day. Like there's no off day for Superman. So we end up having it to where, great. Let me pause here for a second again. All right. So we end up having it to where the Clark kids ends up going out to some party, and so we end up having it to where it seems that since the Kents are new in town, basically, because they've always been in Metropolis, we end up having it to where seemingly there is a girl that is ultimately Lana Lang's daughter that seems that she's going to tie herself onto seemingly Jordan, because ultimately we find out that Jonathan isn't single. So, but it seems that we have it to where ultimately Jordan ends up talking with this girl, and we end up finding out that seemingly Jordan is really having immediately feelings for this girl and eventually kisses her right away. We ultimately find out that this girl, who is Lana Lang's daughter, ultimately has a boyfriend, and this boyfriend ends up attacking Jordan which ultimately Jonathan ends up trying to come to Jordan's protection, and ultimately tries to protect his brother. And we end up finding out that seemingly Jordan is ending up getting clocked by these two other guys. So what ends up happening is that Jordan ends up using his heat vision to explode the fire to make it so where people just run off. So we end up finding out that I guess Jordan is to have superpowers, where it seems that his powers are all on a his powers are used as like an impulse kind of thing, where it's just like basically he kind of does this subconsciously, whatever moves that he has to make to ultimately get something, to protect something, whatever, his body just kind of jumps into action, just kind of protect people kind of thing. So we eventually have it to where Clark is to talk to Jordan and mention how, well, when Jonathan ultimately was kind of thrusted into fatherhood, he had no clue what he was doing. And so we end up having it to where Clark is ultimately saying, it's like, well, hey, I wasn't there for you before, but now I'm going to try to be even more there for you, because his son has powers. And plus, too, when looking at it, Clark doesn't have the reporter job now. Yeah, he's still Superman, but looking at it, I don't think that Jordan is going to be donning a cape and cowl anytime soon. But we're going to end up having it to where probably Clark is eventually going to be teaching, probably through these episodes, Jordan how to use his powers, or to be able to otherwise kind of safely use things and be able to do things. And plus, recently we have it uh, to where Clark could basically learn from all of his parents' mistakes, or all of his mistakes, and otherwise help his son much better than kind of the problems of which that they had before. So ultimately, we have it to where Clark is eventually to be going off on his own to end up finding this man who is otherwise going to be justifiably in this radioactive plant. So we end up having it to where seemingly this guy is very intelligent. It seems that this meddled man seemingly knows every bit of Clark's weaknesses, not being able to see through lead, and that is hence the perfect reason for this guy to otherwise be at a radioactive plant, because it's very hard for Clark to be able to see through things. So we end up having it to where seemingly this guy in this armored suit seems to be able to have jetpacks, he can fly off, and we seemingly have it to where this armored suit is an even match for Clark at any kind of stretch of imaginable things. So eventually we have it to where this guy ends up flying off to try and avoid having to reasonably ending up having to fight Clark hand to hand. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Clark ends up chasing after it. There's a long chase, even in space. They come back from space and all kinds of things. And we end up having it to where this armored man ultimately goes and stabs Clark with a kryptonite blade of sorts. And we end up having it to where Clark eventually falls back into Earth's atmosphere and almost falls in the ground. And seemingly we have it to where Clark eventually, right before he ends up falling to the ground, he ends up taking the kryptonite blade out and ultimately stops himself. So Oh, and one interesting note. Ow, bow, chugga chugga. Yeah, phone. Anyways, so there was one interesting moment that I saw earlier in this episode. So we ended up having it to where Jordan ultimately was playing Injustice, and he was playing against his father because evidently Superman is boring. Thought that was kind of hilarious. Ultimately, we had it uh, to where Jordan was playing as Raiden because Superman is boring. Um, Funny enough, we ended up having Jordan like blaring music, I guess, because I guess his super hearing wasn't working well enough, I guess, during that time, right? Uh, but yeah, we end up finding out that Jordan ended up saving Jonathan from the metal crashing, hence why they only had small concussions, and plus Jordan was easily like I think they were really trying to hide which kid was going to have superpowers first. Eventually, we have it to where Jonathan seemingly has a natural athletic ability. It seems like him doing football is really great, and probably I'm assuming at some point he's probably going to be maybe quite possibly a late bloomer or whatever. So, and I'm kind of wondering if they're going to go the other like Superboy route, the Connor Kent route, where ultimately we're gonna have like maybe a cloned variation of Superboy at some point. I would like to hope somewhere in this show. That'd be kind of interesting to have like a variation of Superboy in the show, or a Superboy Prime, or some other kind of means of different variation of quite possibly Superboy at some point. But anyways, so going into here, so we end up having it to where eventually we are to see who this metal man is, and we ultimately have it to where this metal man is ultimately going and uh, seemingly talking to some machine-esh like voiced person, and we eventually find out that this metal man is none the less than Lex Luthor. I'm like, oh, okay, so this show is going to have quite possibly their own Lex. I'm like, that's interesting. So it'll be interesting to see what is going to be their variation of Lex on this show. Um, and I thought that was kind of fascinating. I I think for most of the show, I think I was kind of won over by a lot of things just easily. We ultimately have it to where eventually Clark is to come home, and we end up having it to where his kids are desperately wanting to hear all the Superman Ash like stories, all the things that ultimately it's like, hey, what happened to so and so? Have you ever met Batman? Kind of thing is I'm assuming one of the questions that ultimately the kids are probably desperate to ask their father. Um, but anyways, so going on into here, like it's a very interesting show. I really like it so far, and I think so far I'm probably gonna call this one a review. If there's any little things that I forgot to mention, I apologize. If there was stuff that didn't go really heavily over in detail, or I went back into, or anything like that. Recently, yeah. I thought that this show was a big old thumbs up. Recently for me, I thought it was like, man, this story is much better than Supergirl or Stargirl, Wonder Woman, um, Batwoman. Definitely better than the pilot of Flash. I was like, when I was watching Flash, I was like, I'm like, this is such a boring and silly show. But then when I went and watched this one, I was like, you know what, I'm really liking this, and I probably shouldn't. I like the fact that it kind of went into the nostalgic approach. Like it gave you like a comic book approach to this show, to this story, and I kind of can't wait to see more episodes. What ends up happening with this show? If it ends up going really good, or if it ends up going like dirt poor, sour, crappy. Um, we end up having it to where Clark is going to eventually, at the tail end of this episode, he's going to teach his kids how to use some of farm equipment because I think that Clark is eventually just going to be working on the farm now. So because eventually we have it to where Lois and Clark have to decide, just like, well, like, are we just going to live on the farm now? Is that what we're going to do? And ultimately Clark is like, yeah, I guess we might. Why not? Like, it would be the easiest thing to do. Maybe we'll have Lois just kind of ultimately just be uh, maybe going into Metropolis to be still a reporter, or maybe we'll end up having her kind of finding a much more home job or whatever. But anyways, yeah, I really enjoyed this episode because I can't say I'm enjoying this show so far because it's only one episode. So I really enjoyed the story. I really enjoyed, like, there was a lot of kind of rushing through things, I think, through this episode, but like they also like I was like, man, are they gonna? How much are they gonna comb through in this one episode? How much are they gonna have to go through in this whole episode? I was like, holy crap! Like the entire like story of Clark, like their variation of like, well, is Jonathan dead? Is Martha dead? Is whoever dead? Is whatever? Like, who's still alive in this story? And they had to kind of tell. They had to tell everything. So when looking at it, I'm like, well, I'm wondering if this is just going to be an hour special, but then eventually they're going to have shorter episodes. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be an hour length. If ultimately it stays an hour length, I'll be fine with that. Because so far this show has won me over. So I think that's all I wanted to say about this episode so far. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.